lot of people have never had money and they don't need money. So we get rejected like that a lot because, you know what? They don't care about that stuff. They don't care about your money. They never had it. They're never going to have it.
They say money changes everything. But for some people, it never mattered to begin with. Frank Fritz was one of those rare souls. Long before fame knocked on his door, Frank had already found wealth in forgotten objects. But when the world discovered him lifeless in his home, no one could have imagined the magnitude of what he left behind. Hidden behind that quiet demeanor was a $6 million secret, an untold story tucked away in handwritten journals, a treasure trove of over 75 vintage motorcycles, and oddities like Aerosmith's lost tour van and a Star Wars Yoda prototype thought to be destroyed. What shocked people most wasn't just what he owned. It was the pain, betrayal, and revelation of who was plotting to steal everything he had built. Born in 1963 in Davenport, Iowa, Frank never fit into the typical mold. While other kids were chasing footballs, he was hoarding coins, rocks, and rusty beer cans. Even razor blades fascinated him, not out of danger, but for the mystery and history they carried. His eye was always on what others overlooked, a trait that would later catapult him into stardom. By high school, he had already met Mike Wolfe, the person who would become both a friend and business partner. The two bonded over their obsession with antiques, skipping traditional routes to chase a passion that felt far more fulfilling than a college lecture ever could. For nearly 25 years, Frank worked as a fire inspector, but his heart never left collecting. At just 16, he purchased a 1964 Harley-Davidson for over $4,000, an amount that stunned his parents. Yet that bike was more than a ride. It was history on two wheels. He spent years working in places like Coast to Coast Hardware to feed his growing addiction to vintage motorcycles, eventually building a private barn to house his collection that would swell to over 100 bikes. What truly set Frank apart was his ability to spot value where others saw junk. His so-called picker's eye was sharp. Whether he was combing through an attic or inspecting an old building, he had a sixth sense for buried gems. Even during fire inspections, he'd stumble upon abandoned gear, fire helmets, alarms, old signage that others would ignore. To Frank, each item whispered a story. Over time, this ability became his edge, sharpening his instincts and creating a roadmap for what would later become television gold. One particular moment etched itself in Frank's memory. He bought a seemingly worthless object for just $15 and flipped it for $475. That was the day he realized his knowledge wasn't just a hobby, it was a marketable skill. In 2002, he made the leap and opened Frank's Finds in Savannah, Illinois. Nestled inside an old opera house, his shop was less of a store and more of a living museum. Every corner oozed nostalgia. Visitors described it as dark and cluttered, but to Frank, it was filled with stories, each item chosen with purpose. The shop's success caught the attention of his old friend Mike Wolfe, who was filming their picking adventures. At first, Frank hesitated. His store was his safe haven. But another incredible flip, a tiny badge bought for $115 and sold for over $1,400, gave him the final push. That adrenaline, what he called a gambler's rush, reminded him of the thrill he could chase beyond the walls of his shop. He understood risk and took precautions to protect his growing empire. Financially, Frank made deliberate, strategic choices. He avoided Hollywood glitz and remained rooted in his Midwestern sensibilities. His spending habits leaned toward appreciating assets, motorcycles, antiques, vintage collectibles, rather than fleeting luxuries. His lesson was clear: invest in what you know and what holds its value, and always have a fallback. Even at the height of his fame, Frank never let go of his small-town grounding. That mindset helped him navigate both the industry and his finances with uncommon wisdom. Long before cameras followed his every move, Frank was obsessed with motorcycles. That passion wasn't a television gimmick. It was his escape. His first bike, a 1964 Harley-Davidson, wasn't just metal and chrome. It was freedom. Over the years, he transformed that teenage dream into a museum-like collection of over 35 vintage motorcycles. Stored in a barn near his Iowa home, his collection was filled with historic gems, rare Indians, British icons like Triumph and Vincent, and even a one-of-a-kind Von Dutch XAVW. That bike, a Frankenstein mix of Harley frame and VW engine, wasn't just rare, it was legendary. Frank had spotted it in a magazine decades earlier, only to stumble across it at a yard sale like fate had been holding it for him. His book, How to Pick Vintage Motorcycles, wasn't a vanity project. It was Frank's love letter to the road, the thrill of the hunt, and the beauty of forgotten machines. He didn't write for scholars. He wrote for dreamers, for anyone who looked at a dusty bike and saw a story worth saving. That same respect bled into his obsession with firehouse memorabilia. Having worked as a fire inspector for 25 years, he had access to closed-down stations and antique equipment that others overlooked. He didn't just collect brass extinguishers and leather helmets. He collected memories of communities, of men who once ran into danger with nothing but instinct and courage. But what made Frank truly different was how he saw every item, not as an object, but as a portal. Old tools, strange toys, war memorabilia. They weren't collectibles to him. They were pieces of American life. He often spent more time listening to a seller's story than haggling over price. When a piece had historical weight, especially anything connected to a fallen soldier, he didn't keep it. He gave it to museums. That kind of reverence can't be faked, and it's why people loved him. Yet, while his collections grew, his body was quietly breaking. For more than 3 decades, Frank lived with Crohn's disease, a painful condition that exhausted him physically and emotionally. He pushed through it in silence, filming American pickers with a smile while his insides screamed. By the time he was in his 50s, it wasn't just Crohn's wearing him down. It was the pressure of fame, the isolation of being watched, judged, followed. In 2017, the facade cracked. Pulled over for driving on the wrong side of the road, he admitted to mixing alcohol and anti-anxiety meds. He'd been prescribed Xanax, but that wasn't the headline. The real story was the weight of being seen and misunderstood. He was spiraling, and the world was watching. He took a plea deal, avoided jail, but his reputation, carefully built over a decade, was already bruised. That incident peeled back the layers. Fame wasn't just draining Frank, it was drowning him. And then came the real heartbreak, his falling out with Mike Wolfe. For fans, Mike and Frank were inseparable, but behind the scenes, silence had taken over. By 2021, Frank confessed they hadn't spoken in 2 years. After his back surgery, there was no call from Mike, no check-in, no support. Frank felt abandoned, like a supporting act in a one-man show. It was like being in a band with Steven Tyler, he once said. You're never going to be the front man. So when Mike posted online that he missed Frank called it fake. Just words, probably written by someone else. He didn't believe it. Not anymore. Despite the betrayal, a sliver of hope appeared in May 2023. A mutual friend orchestrated a quiet reunion. But even that moment of connection couldn't reverse the damage. During the pandemic, alone and hurting, Frank injured his back. Surgery followed, then isolation, heartbreak, and addiction. July 14, 2022. A friend walked into Frank's farmhouse and found him on the floor, unmoving, unable to speak. It was a stroke, a massive one. The damage to his brain was irreversible. He was rushed to the hospital, then to a nursing home. When he finally returned home, he required full-time care. His once vibrant life, road trips, auctions, laughter, had been replaced by stillness. But the tragedy wasn't just the stroke. It was everything that came before it. The silence, the rejection, the feeling of being replaced. And now, the world is finally seeing the weight he carried for decades. From the outside, Frank seemed to live a dream. Fame, fortune, freedom. But look closer, and the cracks were always there. Financially, Frank Fritz's life followed a classic rise and fall arc. At the height of his career, his net worth hovered around $6 million, built from American pickers, his book sales, and private deals in the antique world. His real estate holdings included a picturesque Iowa farmhouse, an extensive barn-turned museum, and adjacent land valued at over $1.5 million combined. The vehicles in his possession weren't just collectibles, they were testaments to his character. Dozens of vintage motorcycles, a few classic Ford trucks, and a customized touring van, each hand-picked, each cherished. He was also known for his love of high-end watches, favoring vintage Rolexes and the occasional Omega Speedmaster. While he never flaunted his wealth, Frank had an eye for timeless luxury. He never bought jets or yachts. Instead, he invested in stories, in pieces of the past. Unlike many celebrities, his wealth wasn't about flash, it was about legacy. What shook many fans was the staggering rate at which Frank's fortune began to vanish. Despite years of success on American pickers, his medical expenses ballooned to an unsustainable $30,000 a month, amounting to over $350,000 annually. In contrast, his investment income was just a fraction of that at $60,000 per year. His conditions, Crohn's disease, COPD, and the aftermath of his stroke demanded round-the-clock nursing, advanced physical therapy, and specialized equipment. As the numbers rose, hope began to fall. Even close friend Jerry Jandro confessed that auctioning Frank's antiques was discussed, an emotional yet pragmatic consideration. Jerry believed fans would rally to it, not just out of admiration, but because every item told a piece of Frank's journey. Still, Jerry recalled with sorrow how Frank's awareness of his condition became the most painful burden of all. The man who once traveled across America in search of forgotten treasures was now a prisoner in his own body. And though his mind remained sharp, his body betrayed him. Limbs that refused to move, speech that struggled to form, hope that slowly slipped away. Then came that final moment. On September 30th, 2024, Mike Wolfe received the devastating call. He rushed to Frank's side, held his hand, rubbed his chest, whispered love and forgiveness. "Go find your mom," he told him, one last act of brotherhood. At 8:50 p.m., Frank took his final breath. With Mike, his mother, and her best friend Annette Oberberlander beside him, Frank left the world in the arms of those who had loved him deeply. Annette would later say, Mike never wavered. He stood by Frank to the very end. But what came next stunned everyone. Hidden in Frank's garage was a motorcycle collection so rare, so detailed, that collectors described it as one of the most significant finds in recent decades. Over 75 vintage bikes, dating back to a 1912 original, stood preserved or patiently awaiting restoration. Each machine had a tale. Some had appeared on American pickers, others never seen before. A 1922 Ace 4, once purchased for $45,000, had skyrocketed to nearly $200,000 in value. The 1939 Indian 4 Aristocrat stood proudly at $115,000. He owned 3 Harley-Davidson panheads from the 50s, and perhaps the rarest of all, a 1947 Indian Chief prototype with a design so unique that experts couldn't match it to any known model. It could be worth over $250,000 alone, but it wasn't just the machines that captivated hearts. It was the story etched into every journal Frank kept. Dozens of notebooks dating back more than 3 decades filled with details of where he found each bike, its previous owners, and the challenges he faced breathing life back into rusted relics. These weren't just mechanical items, They were pieces of Frank's soul. Joe Perry was floored. Ray Tabino got emotional. That van had hauled their dreams when they were broke, unknown, and desperate. It was another example of Frank's uncanny eye for the meaningful, the forgotten, the sacred. From pop culture to the bizarre, Frank collected it all. He once bought a massive elephant's head for $9,500, which eventually landed with Jack White. Yes, that Jack White, who saw a kind of symbolism in it, tying it to his hit album Elephant. Frank also preserved a Jell-O advertising wagon from the early 1900s, now displayed proudly in a museum. He even owned rare Star Wars memorabilia, including 4 original Yoda prototypes, confirmed by a former Lucasfilm artist as real, based on Einstein-inspired early designs. Frank paid handsomely, but they're now worth over $6,000 each. But with every powerful life comes inevitable conflict. In February 2025, Frank's father, William Bill Fritz, filed a lawsuit claiming the 2023 will was forged. That document had left Frank's $6 million estate to his caregivers and friends, excluding Bill entirely. The suit alleges Frank couldn't have signed anything legally, given the court had ruled him unfit after his stroke in 2022. Bill claimed he had been deliberately kept away during Frank's final years, despite once being close enough to fish together in St. Thomas. Now, a jury must decide if the signature was real, and whether Frank's true intentions were honored or manipulated. But let's step beyond the legal drama and into the financial legacy Frank leaves behind. At his career's peak, Frank's net worth had climbed to an estimated $8 million, bolstered by his TV earnings, royalties, and private sales of antiques. Even after medical expenses eroded it, his assets, including the hidden motorcycle collection, kept his estate afloat. With the estimated auction value of his bikes and collectibles, his net worth at death could rebound to nearly $9 million once the estate is fully liquidated. Experts project that his estate's value could continue to rise posthumously, especially with memorabilia auctions and potential book or documentary deals. Future projections hover near $11 million. Frank's real estate empire was modest but meaningful. He owned multiple properties across Iowa and Tennessee, some renovated and packed with vintage Americana. He didn't boast mansions, but his homes were full of history, pieces of architecture that told stories just like the man himself. His vehicles were equally unique. Beyond motorcycles, he owned classic Fords and restored Chevys, and even had a luxury Lincoln Continental he rarely drove, but often polished. Frank also had an impressive collection of high-end watches, Rolex, Omega, and one rare 1969 Heuer Autavia that's now worth over $20,000. His private insurance portfolio was reportedly extensive. Sources close to him revealed he held high-value asset protection policies on his motorcycles, health coverage even post-stroke, and long-term disability insurance that helped buffer costs during his decline. He also had career insurance, a smart move for someone in TV and physical labor, which covered financial losses when he was forced off American pickers. From a financial lens, Frank's journey offers rare insights. His biggest lesson? Diversify your passions. His investments weren't just in stocks. They were in culture, legacy, history. Frank showed that wealth isn't just measured by cash flow, but by what you leave behind. He didn't chase flashy endorsements. He bought meaningful things and held them. In a world obsessed with fast money, Frank quietly built a fortune rooted in slow discovery. So as legal battles unfold and the world debates over wills and court filings, Frank's real story rises above it all. Hit like, drop a comment, and subscribe. More wild Hollywood legends are coming. And remember, and away we go.